Welcome to all Caribbean entrepreneurs. If you've been ready and waiting to take your business digital and get paid online while you sip something strong on the beach, this podcast is for you. We'll hear from the Caribbean's finest entrepreneurs on topics like e-commerce, business development, brand building, social media, their wins and failures. This is the only place in the region helping you navigate the digital age from the Caribbean's perspective. This is Digipreneur FM. And now, let's give it up for the Digiboss himself, Mr. Karan Rose.
Thank you to everybody tuning in to another episode of the Digipreneur FM podcast. And as usual, it is your boy, Mr. Rose, and we are back. DJ, can you fade us all the way out so we can talk to the good folks in the Digipreneur family? It is December 12th, 2022. And this is episode number 113. 113. No, I'm lying. See, this is why I always have to check. It's episode number 114. Episode 114. Good folks, how is everybody doing? It's Monday. I hope your weekend was good. I hope it was relaxing, rejuvenating. I hope, you're starting to wind down so you guys can relax. I'm hoping to hear that some of you guys are on vacation, preferably traveling out of country or looking to get out the country and go do some sightseeing for this Christmas season, for this holiday season. So listen, since COVID has kind of, I don't know if it's still here, COVID's doing its thing, but the world has kind of opened back up and everybody has been traveling. And if you have not been able to travel as yet, since COVID is or the measures for COVID have relaxed, I hope that you do get the opportunity during the holiday season or early next year, because I know some industries pick up during the holiday season and they quiet down from January. So either or, I hope you are being able or given the opportunity to go out and travel, go and relax, go, hear a different accent, or go hear a different language, go see a different beach, or maybe your idea of vacation is seeing some snow. That's not my idea of a vacation, but I know there's a lot of people who, again, you were raised in the heat. Beaches ain't nothing new to you, so you just want to go see some snow. You want to go see some big buildings. I understand. I've had my fill. Now, I just want to see beaches, white sand, drinks with little umbrellas in it, and me just relaxing. That's my idea of a vacation now. So let's get to it. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about, excuse me, creating a successful podcast. And I'm going to be giving you guys, let me see how many tips I wrote down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 8 tips on creating a successful podcast. Now, This is a bit new for me. I'm actually recording this episode midday. So typically I like to record my episodes at between 3 and 5 a.m. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, nobody's awake, so I don't have anybody calling me or anybody that needs me. I can just wake up, do my morning routine and get to work and bang out the podcast. Without any kind of hassle. And then I also like to do it because I like to give content to those people who are doing their morning commute. Or maybe you're in the gym in the morning. Whatever you're doing, I like to be, my whole thought process is, have the content ready so that somebody who is in an hour morning of traffic, they can turn on a podcast and listen to the entire episode and get some good uplifting content to make you feel good to start your day. That's really, where my mindset is. I like to have my content ready and there for you so that your mornings could start, your day could start on a good note with the podcast. All right. But today, I'm doing it midday. So I'm actually recording it at 11 o'clock in the morning. And I've never recorded a podcast early in the morning. I've done some late at night, like evening time where I've gone live on Instagram. I've done an Instagram live, recorded the podcast in the night, and then I would just, if you watch the Instagram live, you would have got the content right then and there. But then I would schedule out the podcast for first thing in the morning. All right. But yeah, so I guess even for me, I'm kind of winding down myself, and I kind of woke up today and I just kind of took it slow. I did breakfast a little bit later, read my book a little bit later, and I'm like, you know what? Let's record a podcast midday and let's see how it goes. So podcasting has been something that I started in 2021. Yeah, 2021. And 114 episodes later, we are still here, and it's just been growing, and it's really been a medium that I thoroughly enjoy. I've loved blogging for, since I've started my business back in 2016. I've started up, even before I had a business, I started off blogging and creating content via blogs. And I loved blogging because you don't need anything fancy. You don't need no lights, you don't need no cameras. It's just you, your computer, turn the music up, turn your headphones up, and you just write, right? And I love podcasting because it kind of gives me the same vibe where, again, I don't need no lights, cameras. I just need my mic, my computer, and when I'm, just writing out my thoughts or what I want to talk about, my music is up and I'm getting myself in my zone. And then as soon as I'm ready to record, music cuts off and there's no fanfare. The video doesn't need to be on. I don't need to be dressed up. I don't need to bring video level energy. And for me, the energy that I bring on video is different than the energy that I have for audio-only podcasting, and it's different from blogging. I'm always in the mood to write. I'm always in the mood to podcast, but I'm not always in the mood to be on video. Right? And I know there's a lot of people who feel like, oh my God, we keep hearing video, in order to find success. And the truth is that you don't need to be doing video content to find success. You can build a massive brand via just written content, because that's why articles and blogs are still are huge. Podcasts are only going up, right? So you can do audio only podcasts and blow up with that. But I mean, where video really comes into play is if you're trying to build on social media, then you really got to throw in video content if you want to have success on social media. But remember, social media is just one channel, right? There's a bunch of other channels that don't require you to do video, but you need to be doing something. So if you're not doing video, you better be, writing blogs or doing articles, or you better have a podcast, all right? So I do everything, but podcasting, I could just roll out of bed, drink some tea or drink a coffee, and write out my thoughts and just roll into my computer and hit record and start to work, right? I don't have to go and change my clothes, whatever. Like, I could just record in my pajamas, and I love that, right? So we are here 114 episodes later, and the podcast has been doing some tremendous numbers. And you don't ever know where things are going to go when you start, but I mean, the more you are consistent, the more you put out, and the more you just refine, and get better at what you do, things kind of take care of themselves, right? And I just got my Spotify Wrapped. And Spotify does this thing where every single year they give you a yearly review of how your podcast performed for the year, right? And when I got the podcast Wrapped a couple days ago and I was looking at it and I was like, yo, Digipreneur FM has really done some great things this year. Shout outs to everybody. Shout outs to you who have made this possible. But Digipreneur FM has done some really good things this year. And, in sharing it, like I shared the Spotify Wrapped on social media, whatever. And I mean, naturally, I always get asked questions about, how to do things in podcasting or advice or tips on podcasting. And I'll share those things when people ask me, whatever. But just seeing the Spotify Wrapped, and I'm going to go through the Spotify Wrapped so you guys can see how the Digipreneur FM podcast did. I'm going to go through it. And I also wanted to give you guys like some tips on creating a successful podcast, because to me, the podcast is in my eyes, the podcast has definitely been a success. And I'm also going to go through some key podcast stats so you guys can get the lay of the land as to, the podcast industry. And this is the stats of podcasting for November. So Buzzsprout, which is one of the biggest, I'm gonna start with the podcast stats. Then I'm gonna go into the Spotify Wrapped, and then I'm gonna go into my tips for creating a successful podcast. So Buzzsprout's one of the largest platforms in the world, podcast hosts in the world. And they share monthly reports on all the data that they collect on podcasting and what is happening on their platform. And again, they are like the largest podcasting host. So they get a lot of data that they collect, and they kind of collate it and send out this monthly report so you can see, how well the industry of podcasting is doing. So for November 2022, there was over 121 million downloads for podcasts in November, right? There was over 121 million. Exactly 121,614,702 downloads for podcasting. That's a lot. There was 176,000 new episodes that came out for the month. And currently, 120,000 active podcasts. All right? Now that's crazy because there's a billions. I think let me see, how many active, I'm just going to do a quick search. How many active blogs are there? There is an estimated number of global blogs of 572 million. Wow. 572 million global blogs, 120,000 active podcasts, but there are 572 million blogs. All right, let's see how many active YouTube channels. How many active? Nah, I won't be able to get that. There are more than 51 million YouTube channels out there. Okay, yeah. As of 2022, there are more than 51 million YouTube channels. Jeez. 51 million YouTube channels, 572 million blogs, 120,000 active podcasts. Crazy. So again, these are good stats because this is why podcast is blowing up. It's still, it's blowing up because it's the less saturated of the mediums, right? It's like the less saturated of the mediums in terms of written content, video content, and and audio content, right? So let's take a look and see. So when we talk about podcasts, we know that we listen to podcasts on a podcast platform. That could be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, web browsers, Google Podcasts, you name it, right? So I'm going to give you guys the top podcast platforms that people are consuming podcasts on. So 38% of podcasts are consumed on Apple Podcasts. 26% of podcasts are consumed on Spotify. 3%, this is a massive drop, but 3% of podcasts are consumed via the web browser. So people actually going on their web browser and going to like the podcast website and just streaming the podcast from the website, right? Then 2% are happening on Google Podcasts, 2% on Apple iTunes, and then 1% on Buzzsprout's embedded player, 1% on Castbox, 1% on Podcast Addicts, and then it kind of just goes down from there, right? But those are the top. So the top 5 is Apple Podcast, then Spotify, then web browser, then Google Podcasts, and Apple iTunes, right? Those are the top 5 platforms that people are using to consume podcasts. And let's take a look and see what else. So these are some really interesting stats, all right? So in terms of episode downloads within the first 7 days, the top 1% of podcasts, this is the top 1%, get 4,600 downloads within the first 7 days. The top 5% of podcasts get 979 downloads in the first week. The top 10% get 400 downloads. The top 25% get 105 downloads. And the top 50%, so this is obviously the medium, this is the middle ground. Top 50% get 30 downloads a week. All right. Now, I know those numbers don't sound sexy because you're thinking about social media, the views, the likes. Oh, you drop a post and you get 1,000 likes. And, these are not, those numbers don't sound as sexy as, the vanity metrics over on social media. But here's the thing, right? Studies have shown that podcast listeners have more brand affinity to your brand than almost any other medium out there. So the people who tend to listen to your podcast have a closer relationship to your brand, studies have shown, and they are more of a super fan than people who just casually watch your content on social media. All right? So think about it. This is also why they say that on average, people subscribe to about 7 podcasts on average. Because and we're going to get into like the duration of the podcast, but podcast is typically one of the top pieces of long form content. So people will turn you on and listen to you while they work out, while they cook, while they fold clothes, while they do housework, while they drive to work or they're driving home in their long commutes. They're listening to you, right? So when people are listening to you, when this is another thing about podcasts allow for passive consumption, meaning people can, turn you on and do other things while they're listening to you. So not everybody's going to have that privilege where you're going to be in people's intimate settings. People are inviting you into their intimate settings with podcasts. And this is another thing that just varies greatly from any other form of content, right? People turn you on and cook. People turn you on and work out. People turn you on a commute. It's just them in the car. They turn your episode on, they put it in the car speakers, and they just drive with you in their psyche. Or they put their earbuds in and you are right in their head. You are right in their eardrum. Your words are caressing their eardrums, right? So podcast is very intimate. So people subscribe to on average 7 podcasts. And this is why people just have a greater affinity to the brand when you have a podcast, because you are in their personal spaces with them, keeping them company, and you're doing it for a longer form of time than any other medium. All right? So that brings me to episode duration. These are the stats for, how long typical episodes are. So 32% of, and this is going to answer the question of, how long should your podcast be? My answer to that, I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but my answer to, how long should a podcast be is, whatever you want it to be. Whatever you want it to be, whatever you condition your audience for, they know what they're going to be getting themselves into, right? But this is the stats on the episode duration. So 32% of podcasts are between 20 to 40 minutes. Then 21% of podcasts are between 40 to 60 minutes. Then 15%, so this is a tie, 15%, sorry, let me scratch this 15%. 16% of podcasts are over 60 minutes. And then 15% are between 10 to 20 minutes, and then it's tied with 15% that are less than 10 minutes. So the bulk of the high majority of podcasts are between 20 to 40 minutes and then 40 to 60 minutes. So look at that. The top 3 for duration is over 20 minutes. Over 20 minutes. Again, podcasts are seen as one of the top long-form pieces of content. And when you think about what people are doing when they're listening to podcasts, it's usually because they're turning on a podcast because they know they need company whilst they're doing something that's going to take some time. Right? So if they're working out and they're in the gym, they turn on an hour-long podcast because they know by the time I'm done in the gym, chances are I should be done my workout. My commute is about an hour to work or an hour and a half to work. Chances are, let me turn on an hour podcast or an hour and a half podcast, and that'll keep me company on the commute to work. All right? I'm cooking. Let me turn on the podcast. And then we get to, another top question, which is how often should you be publishing a podcast? So 39% of podcasts, there's an episode published every 8 to 14 days. 39% of people are publishing a podcast every 8 to 14 days. So that's, one just over a week to 2 weeks. And then you have 36%, so this is close, 36% of people are publishing episodes every 3 to 7 days. And then 17% are publishing an episode every 15 to 29 days. My God, that's, every 2 weeks, one a month. And then 7% every 2 days. Now that's, I've seen some people doing it. That's a lot. I like to publish every 3 to 7 days is my thing. So I like to do 2 episodes a week. So I'd fall into that 3 to 7 days. Yeah, 3 to 7 days. Because even some days where, life is hectic and I'm doing a bunch of other stuff, I might not get out 2 episodes, but I'll do my best to get out 1. So those are the top stats for November. Really interesting stuff. And again, podcasts are continuing to blow up because there's just such a low amount of active podcasts, 120,000, right? So more podcasts are going to come. But here's another interesting stat. Pod fade, which is something which is described as, which is described as, how do I explain it? Pod fade is when podcasts cease production. So people start the podcast and then they just cease production. Pod fade, on average, happens by the 7th episode. So usually by the 7th episode, people stop producing podcasts. And that is as high as, I believe the last figure I seen was at like 70%. 70% of podcasts fade. People stop creating podcasts after the 7th episode, which is another reason why active podcasts are so low. Because by the 7th episode, people have stopped podcasting. And it could be for a multitude of reasons. It could be, they don't have the time, bad planning. They weren't getting the results that they did. And it's easy for people to get discouraged with podcasting because, like I said, when you look at download numbers, the numbers are not like 1,000 likes on social media or 50 shares or 100 shares on social media, right? The top 50% of podcasts are getting 30 downloads in the first week, right? So people tend to get discouraged when they see those kinds of numbers. So pod fade tends to happen after, by the 7th to 8th episode, 70% of podcasts, people just stop producing podcasts altogether, right? So, and again, there's a lot that kind of goes into why people have stopped producing podcasts, but I gave you guys a few reasons as to why. Now, I want to get into the Spotify Wrapped. So this was the wrap up that they gave for the Digipreneur FM podcast, and it's just going to kind of detail some of our key stats for the year as to how we did, and it's going to give you guys some examples of what to kind of look for, and then we're going to be getting into the tips for creating a successful podcast. So we got the Spotify Wrapped. Spotify says 2022, you really did your thing. The people loved it. Recreated 2,711 minutes of new content in 2022. That is 98% more than other creators in the business category. That is crazy. So we created we created more content than 98% of the people in the business category. All right. The episode that got the most amount of streams was my episode on how I hit over 10,000 followers on TikTok. That performed 245% better than every other episode that we did. Wow, that's crazy. So people, that one really did well. That one really, really did well. The podcast is listened to, and this one threw me for a loop. But I mean, I kind of knew it because I'm always watching the data. But the podcast was listened to in 110 countries around the world. The podcast was listened to in 110 countries around the world. I thought that was really dope. All right. Then we have, what did it say? Your podcast was in the top 25% most shared globally. The podcast was in the top 25% most shared globally. And they broke down. The majority of the shares happened on WhatsApp. 44% of the podcast was shared via WhatsApp, 28% on direct link, 28% was shared over Instagram, and 8% in other mediums, right? Then let's see. We are in the top 15% of the most followed podcasts, which I thought was crazy. Then they gave us a breakdown of the personality of our podcast listener. They said my podcast listeners are the enthusiasts. Your listeners are super fans. When their favorite podcast releases a new episode, they are among the first to know, going above and beyond to show their support. That's crazy. 89% of your listeners discovered you in 2022. So again, we got growth, right? 89% of people discovered the podcast this year. Then they showed me which episode attracted the most new listeners. So an episode I did with Akeem Branford, 7% of our audience began with that episode. So shout outs to Akeem. Then they gave us a bit of a wrap up. Your podcast saw a lot of gains this year. 213% in hours, 150% more streams, 125% more followers, and 130% more listeners. So people can listen to your podcast without following your podcast. That's the differentiating factor. There are people that follow your podcast, they can get the notifications. And then there's people where they just listen to the podcast. They just type in your name and they listen to it. They don't have to follow the podcast. So we got more followers and more listeners. And this was the wrap up. We are a top 10 podcast for 87 fans. We are a top 5 podcast for 75 fans. And you are the number 1 podcast for 36 fans. That is crazy. Thank you very much. We got to give one of those. Thank you, everybody. Top 10 podcasts for 87 people. Top 5 podcasts for 75 people. And number 1 podcast for 36 people. We hope to grow that in 2023. So that was the Spotify wrap-up, the yearly wrap-up they send you to give you a breakdown of how your podcast performed over the last year. So we really did some great things for 2023, and we saw growth in every single area for the podcast. So how do we do it? Let me give you guys my 8 tips on creating a successful podcast. And I'm sure this is going to look different in a couple of months because I'm going to be tweaking some things over the next couple of months. I'm going to be tweaking some things, but I think I've tinkered a lot over the last year, and I've really come into my own, figured out my formula. But, you got to evolve. So, we're going to be testing out some new things over the next couple of months and see how it goes. So, my first tip in creating a successful podcast is, 1, make sure you start a podcast on a topic that you could speak endlessly about, and it's something that you are passionate about. Because, listen, as I said earlier, pod fade is real. By the 7th or 8th episode, people have stopped. Right? And I think a key part is that people like the idea of a podcast, lights, camera, action, microphone. We're launching a podcast. It's something new. It's not social media. It's not a YouTube channel. It's something different, right? And because of the big global push on podcasts right now, people want to be a part of that. So they want to create podcasts and they jump right in. But then they create podcasts on something that they might not necessarily be super passionate about or something that they can't speak endlessly about. It is easy for me to speak about digital strategy, e-commerce, marketing, entrepreneurship, and interviewing other entrepreneurs. That comes easy for me because I'm very passionate about the topic. I've had to build my own business. I've had to learn all of the different tools, platforms, strategies, tips, tricks on building my brand online and navigating the digital space. And in learning so much, I have a lot to share. I have a lot of questions to ask. I have a lot to read. I have a lot to, I have a zeal in looking at other people and seeing how they're doing their thing and speaking to them and interviewing them and whatnot. So again, this whole space is something that I am very passionate about. And I truly believe that e-commerce and digital is going to be the savior for many small businesses, right, around the world, because the barrier for entry is low, and it's easy for us to get started now more than ever and start to generate money where you can become self-sustaining, right? So it's easy for me to come on here and churn out an hour-long podcast twice a week, right? So that's one of the things you want to ensure. Is this a topic that you can speak endlessly about? Is this something that, you are passionate about? Because boy, oh boy, when you start to see, the numbers not what you thought it was going to be, or, you get to a point where after 7 episodes, you don't really have much to say, then you just fade. And then it just goes down the drain, right? So tip number 2 is, don't overcomplicate it when starting out. It doesn't need to be perfect, but you need to have some basics in place to make it a quality show. And the biggest basic to me, the biggest thing you need when starting out is good audio. Good audio, and have a very easy editing process so you don't frustrate yourself. So I would recommend getting, even if it's a secondhand, a used mic, purchase a microphone. Get a microphone. You can get some microphones on eBay, on Amazon for as low as $50 US, $40 US. Get one secondhand if you're unsure about this thing. But the thing is that whilst you do not need any fancy equipment to start a podcast, let me flip it to you like this. You could use your cell phone and you could use a headset to record an episode, and you can record it with a recording app on your phone, and you could use a headphone headset to record, right? You can do that. But the flip side to that is, when you do that, if the quality isn't good, where people are either struggling to hear you or it just doesn't sound good, you have to keep in mind that there are many people who are listening to your podcast with headphones in. They got earbuds in. And if it doesn't sound good, podcast is the only medium where you're inside people's head. right? They could have a headphones in, listen to your content. And it's not like video, because I know you're thinking, okay, but people can listen to a video with headphones in. It's not the same. People could mute you and read the captions to your video, right? I know a lot of people who will mute the video and just read the captions. But you can't do that for a podcast, right? So the audio has to be good enough so that when somebody is listening to it in their headphones, it's not irritating them. Because you're right in somebody's ear. And if the audio isn't good and you're struggling to hear them, or it's scratchy, or it's just not good, then people just get turned off and they don't listen to your podcast. Which can also work, which obviously is going to work against you, because then when you see, people are not, downloading the podcast, not listening to the podcast, then you just lose interest and you fade. And it could have just been because your quality wasn't good. So purchase a mic. Whether that be, at this point, I usually don't recommend if you're going to go buy a mic, look for a dynamic microphone, right? You want a dynamic microphone versus the omni-channel mics, because when you get the dynamic microphones, what they do is they pick up the sound that's right in front of the microphone, and they kind of filter out background noises, and they only focus on picking up the sound right in front of you. When you get those omni-channel microphones, like the Blue Yetis, right? They focus on picking up the sound all around them. Those are good for like when you have groups. They try to pick up all the sound around, and it just picks up all this background noise that you don't necessarily want. So you want a dynamic microphone that's going to be picking up your voice right in front of the mic. Again, even if it's something cheap, I won't even just tell you brands, just find a dynamic microphone, even if it's cheap, to get started, because this is a journey, right? You don't have to go out and spend $100 in a microphone to get started. Get something cheap. Just get a dynamic microphone. That way it's, again, focusing on the voice in front of you and filtering out the background noises, all right? That way you get some decent audio quality in the beginning, so people listen to your show can listen without, cringing. And in terms of editing, you can use, I use Audacity. Audacity is free. I use Audacity to record my podcast episodes. And if if you're not good, or you don't want to learn how to edit your audio quality, there is a tool. It's a free tool called Auphonic, AUPHONIC, Auphonic. And it's a website where you can upload your audio files, and it will do some post-production editing. And they give you like an allotment of like 3 or 4 hours every single month to edit your audio files, right? So if your podcast is an hour, you'll get like 4. I think it's either 3 or 4 hours for free a month. You'll get 3 or 4 edited episodes, right? And they clean up the audio, and you could use that. I was using that in the beginning when I just got started out, right? So you could use that, get a decent mic, use Auphonic, have it clean up the audio, and then upload it to your podcast host, right? So create an editing process that just doesn't frustrate you, because the easier it is for you to get in and get out with your podcast, the better. You have people who, when they get advanced, will use tools, or they'll take training so that they can stop using the words and and filler words like that. In the beginning, folks, man, don't even worry about that, right? Get your podcast out. That's the most important part. Just get started, get it out. You will start to learn editing tips and tricks as you go along. But just start, right? The only thing I will say is have some decent audio, because as much as you could use your headphones on your phone, if people are not listening to the episode because the quality is not good, then it's gonna kind of work against you. You're gonna get frustrated and you're gonna stop. Tip number 3, make the time to record. I've found that doing it generally when nobody is awake or looking to bother me has helped me, because I can get out what I need, and I'm not, fighting, or people are not trying to fight for my attention. So like I said in the beginning, I don't do midday podcasts because everybody's up. I work with people, I work with companies. emails are coming in, calls are coming in, messages are coming in. And some of the things need timely responses, right? So I like to do my podcast when I know nobody's looking for me, early in the morning or late at night. But whenever, carve out your time to get your stuff done when you know people are not going to be bothering you, right? Then tip number, what are we on? Tip number 4, tinker with your workflow to get it to a point where it becomes second nature to churn out your podcast. So every episode, kind of give it a little review. How did your workflow work for you? Was it frustrating? Was it annoying? Do some research to see how you can come up with a better workflow so that it's not painful for you. So in the beginning, I had my microphone. I was using an audio interface called the Behringer. And this would allow me to connect my microphone via XLR cable into the interface, and the interface would connect to the computer, right? So I'm getting high quality microphone input into the computer to record. And then I would upload it to Auphonic to edit the audio files. And then after that, I would take it and upload it to Podbean, right? Now, Podbean is my host for my podcast audio files. In the beginning, it was cool. It was workable. That was my workflow in the beginning. Record into Audacity, save the file, upload to Auphonic. Auphonic does the post-production, download the file, then upload to Podbean. And that was the best I could do with what I had, with the money I spent on the tools and whatnot, right? But then I was like, in tinkering with my workflow, I'm like, I need to get a faster workflow, because doing everything with what I just laid out would take me like an additional 45 minutes to get it out, right? And I'm like, I need something better. I want something faster. So I invested in a Rodecaster Pro, and the Rodecaster Pro is a whole podcasting system. It does a lot more than podcasting, but it has a whole podcasting system where it has all of these different settings and features to do onboard processing of my audio. That way, the audio that comes out of the Rodecaster is super, super clean. So now I don't have to upload the audio into Auphonic to do post-production editing, because the Rodecaster is doing a heck of a lot of onboard editing or onboard processing of the audio. So that way, when the audio comes out of it, it is really clean, right? Now, again, like I said, you're never not done in terms of tinkering. So over time, I'm going to be doing more tinkering. I'm going to be changing up my microphone. I'm going to upgrade from the Rodecaster Pro that I have, and going to be getting the Rodecaster Pro 2 and look to see what other things I can do to improve on my quality, right? But for now, I have my Audio-Technica ATR 2100X microphone. That XLR cable plugs into my Rodecaster Pro. I've set up the Rodecaster Pro. I've watched some tutorials on YouTube to set up some of the features. That way it can process the audio and I get good quality audio coming out. And Audacity, which is the free program that I use on my Mac, that records the audio and then it spits out a high quality file, which we then upload. So for me, that took away from having to upload a file to Auphonic, right? Upload to Auphonic. Auphonic takes its time to do it, then download the file, then upload. I've removed Auphonic completely from the process, and now I can just take the file that I get from the Rodecaster and Audacity and upload that directly to Podbean, right? So I'm simplifying my workflow. I'm tinkering the workflow to get better quality over time. And now when I get in front of the mic, I know my workflow so well that it's easy for me to churn out podcasts without giving too much of a thought into the production of the podcast, right? And again, we're going to be tinkering over time. Now, tip number 5. Tip number 5, focus on being a show of value. I believe that with the times that we are in, we need more content with substance in the Caribbean. We truly have an overflow of lifestyle content, comedy content, escapism content. We have an overflow of that content, right? There's really no differentiation between a lot of that content now. But whilst it is great for people to unplug, we also need content of substance to help people and raise the morale, the skill sets, and the mindset of our collective society. We have so many skilled people in a variety of different industries. We need more content that is going to help raise the conscious level of our society. We need more content of substance. And if you can create a podcast of substance right now in the Caribbean, because we have such a lack for it, it's going to be easy for you to differentiate yourself amongst a lot of the noise. Because remember, on social media, you're fighting with everybody else. You're fighting with everybody else for people's attention, right? So if you can create a show of substance, remember, people that listen to podcasts have a greater affinity to the people that they are listening to, right? They're going to be more willing to gel with your brand, to listen to your brand. If you can do that, you're going to separate yourselves from the market, and people are going to be more inclined to listen to you and subscribe to you and be that super fan for your brand, because people are looking for content of substance. But we have such a lack for it that we always have to go to outside sources for content of substance. But we need more of that right here, because we know that the information, the things that people are talking about in other markets, not always relevant for us. We constantly have to, put it into context for our markets, but we need more of our own people creating content for us, right? So, be a show of substance. Tip number, what are we on? What is that, 6? Tip number 6? Yeah, tip number 6. Mix up your solo shows with interviews. Interviews take a lot of planning and prepping. So if you can mix that up with solo content, it allows you to get content out on your own time. So whenever I do see people create podcasts across the Caribbean, everybody wants to create interview shows. Interviews allow you to cross-pollinate with other people's audience, because you're going to get to interview other people who may have a bigger following than you. It's the easiest way to build a following, because you're going to be putting yourselves in the sights of their following and cross-pollinating. But we have a lot of interview-style shows. We have a lot. It's the first thing that people think of when it comes to podcasting in the Caribbean. Let's do an interview show, right? And then you realize that planning interview-style shows is a lot. You got to work with your timing and then their timing, and then it throws you off when the timing doesn't work out, and it puts you at the mercy of your guests. You have some guests who don't even show up when they're supposed to, or something comes up and you guys have to reschedule. It takes a lot to do interview-style shows, and that's another reason why Pod Fade happens. Because people want to do interview-style shows, and the planning throws people off. When you get to a point where your brand becomes like the big platform that everybody wants to get a hold of, then, you don't really have that problem as much, because people are dying to get on your show, right? I've seen some of the top podcasters even charge people to be on their show. Now, they know that being on the show brings value, because they have a massive audience, and if people come on their show, then they're going to get business, they're going to grow, they're going to be exposed, so their platform is value. But then securing a payment also ensures that the people who are coming on their platform are not going to waste the production team's time, and they're going to show up when they are supposed to. So yes, there are people that are charging you to be on their show. That way they know you're not going to waste their time, right? So that's why mix up. If you're going to be doing interview shows, mix it up with some solo shows. I prefer to do the reverse. I prefer to do solo shows and mix it up with interviews, because the solo shows 100% rely on me. It's whenever I have the time to do it, and I will make the time to make the content. I don't need nobody else to come in and do the show with me. So it's easy for me to be consistent and not having to worry about anybody else. I prefer to do solo shows and then sprinkle in the interview shows. And I mean, next year, because this year was a weird year where I was in the midst of moving, I was in the midst of renovating, and then, I started to travel, and just a lot was happening this year. With my schedule, I know for a fact I was not going to be in a position to be interviewing people, and I had to kind of just do shows on my own time. So, again, I knew what my situation was. I really wasn't focusing too much on interview shows this year. But next year, I'm definitely going to be, now that I'm set up, I've moved, I've finished the office, the studio, and I've renovated. Now it's easier for me to now start to plan out next year's interviews. And again, our show has become a platform where people want to be interviewed on the platform, right? Whether they get interviewed on the radio show, whether they get interviewed on the podcast platform, people want to be on the platform. So, we'll get more interviews next year. But mix it up. If you're doing interviews, mix it up with some solo shows. All right? Tip number 7. I decided to build a website for my podcast. So that's where digipreneur.fm, the website, comes in. I decided to build the website. This is not, you don't have to do this, but I decided to build it because it allows for more discoverability through the search engines, right? Remember, when you go on Google or on Bing and you search for anything, it's usually a link to a website. Even if they're pulling the information out and serving it to you in a featured snippet, or the people also ask, you're always getting a link to a website. So I decided to build a website to increase discoverability through the search engines. That way they show up in search. And also, people can listen to the podcast on the website without having to download any additional apps to listen to the podcast. So this is what has helped truly increase my listenership, because it's being discovered in the search engines, but then people now don't have to go and download a app to listen to the podcast. I've also time-stamped the episodes on the website. That way when people do a search and an episode pops up, they can see a little bit of a write-up, but then they can just click on one of the timestamp parts and listen to that piece of the podcast to get the information that they want. And then if they want to subscribe, they can do that from the website. They can go and subscribe through any other platform, or if they have a preferred podcast player that they use, they would then go and subscribe to the podcast on whatever podcast platform that they listen to. But that initial part of discoverability, they can do a Google search or a Bing search, an episode shows up, they can read what the episode is about, they can click on a timestamp piece, hear what they want to hear, and then they can decide whether or not this is something that they want to listen to. They can listen to the entire episode from the website, they can listen to pieces from the timestamp spots, but that website has been the second highest place where people listen to my podcast. So when I look at my hosting stats, the number one place people listen to my podcast is on Apple Podcasts. The second highest place where people listen to podcasts from my podcast is on a web browser. So people are listening to the web browsers there, again, because it's showing up in search, and then they can listen to the time-stamped pieces, or they can just stream the entire thing from the website without having to download an app. And because of how the web browsers are now, people can minimize the web browser, and Chrome and Safari and Firefox will play the episode in the background. So people can turn off their phone, they could turn off their screen, and it's still going to play in the background, right? So website for the podcast has helped tremendously get my podcast out to more countries, more people, more downloads. And last but not least, tip number 8. There is no standardization of how long your podcast needs to be. So I like to have my podcast an hour in length, mainly because I'm thinking about, people that are commuting to work, or they're in the gym, or, they're cooking a meal. The average commute is about an hour. The average gym session is about an hour. So that's where my mindset is, right? And that's why I read to you guys the Buzzsprout stats about episode duration. So 32% of the majority of podcasts are 20 to 40 minutes, right? So whatever you decide to groom your podcast audience for, that is what they're going to accept. And they'll tell you, hey, we want longer episodes, or hey, this was too long, or what. But they will tell you. And keep in mind, the number one podcast in the world, which is the Joe Rogan Show, that's a 3 to 4 hour podcast. So if you're thinking that people do not have the attention spans, people just don't have the attention spans on social media. They have the attention spans for YouTube. They have the attention spans for Netflix. They have the attention spans for podcasts. They have the attention spans for written content. They can skim and see if there's something they want to read. And then once they enjoy it, they'll read the entire thing. So people have the attention spans just out on social media. So if you want to create a long podcast, you go for it, right? The highest stats all favor podcasts over 20 minutes. Right? 20 to 40 minutes, 40 to 60, and over 60 are the top 3 formats or top 3 times for podcasts. So you can create a long form podcast. But again, there is no standardization. One of the top podcasts I listen to is 5 minutes in length. They do 5-minute power episodes. So you can do that, right? Whatever you groom your audience for, that is what they're going to come to expect, and that is what, they will accept. So those are my top 8 tips for creating a successful podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed episode 100. And what did I say? Did I say 113? What was it? What did I say? 113? No, 114. I had to go and pull it up. So hope you guys enjoyed episode 114. This was definitely fun. And I'm hoping to see, more podcasts, more successful podcasts come out of the Caribbean next year. Because when I go on, there's a platform called Chartable, right? And you could search for any podcast you want, and it's going to show you the rankings of the podcasts on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, right? And when I pull up my podcast, it shows you the rankings of the podcasts on Apple Podcasts in each country. So once your podcast starts to rank in a country on Apple or on Spotify, it's going to show you where your podcast is ranking. And the podcasts start to rank from 200, right? Over 200, they're not tracking from 200 and up. But once you are within the first 200, they start to rank you. And whenever I see my podcast, so right now the podcast is number 2 in Trinidad, number 1 in business, number 1 in entrepreneurship, number 30 in all podcast categories for Jamaica, number 2 in business, and number 4 in entrepreneurship. In Jamaica, when I look at the top ranking podcasts in each of those countries, Trinidad and also in Jamaica, I don't see any other Caribbean podcasts. So when I look at entrepreneurship podcasts for Trinidad, right? The top 5 podcasts is number 1 is Digipreneur Me. Number 2 is Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO. Then Tay Daniels' Breadwinner Energy Podcast. Then Kay Hillman, Becoming CEO. Then Faye Cornhill, the Wedding Business Podcast. Top 5 podcasts, there's nobody else from the Caribbean. When I just go down even lower, top 10, nobody else that's in the Caribbean is in the top 10 for Trinidad and Tobago. When I go over to Jamaica, let me look at the top 10 in Jamaica. The number 1 podcast for entrepreneurship is Andrew Tate's Tate Speech in Jamaica. Number 4 is me. The rest of the top 10, nobody else from the entire Caribbean is ranking in these podcasts, in Apple Podcasts. The number 1 place for podcasts is Apple Podcasts. That's the number 1 platform. And looking in the business and entrepreneurship category, nobody else is ranking. And even if I were to go in all podcasts, so just the top ranking podcasts all together, right? So this is all categories, all included. The top 5 podcasts in Jamaica, none of them are Caribbean. None of them are great. The top 5 podcasts. Let's scroll down. Top 10. None of the top 10 podcasts in Jamaica are Caribbean. Let me go over to Trinidad. Trinidad, top 10. Number 2 is Private Ryan. The rest of the top 10, no other Caribbean person. So we need more Caribbean people creating podcasts. We need more Caribbean people learning how to market and grow the podcast. That way they can start to chart. Because right now you're creating podcasts and you're not charting. And if you're not charting, it means you're not getting the downloads, you're not getting the listens. So all of that is going to come with learning how to market your podcast, learning how to grow your podcast so that you can start to chart. And once you're charting, we know that people are downloading your content on your platforms. All right. So that's it for me for episode 114. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you follow me on social media, Keron Rose, KERONROSE, on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. All right, follow me over on those social media platforms. I'm most active on LinkedIn, Instagram. Instagram stories, I show a lot of my behind the scenes. You guys can also learn more about building your digital presence and monetizing your platforms on KeronRose.com. I'll link to that in the show notes. KERONROSE.com, link in the show notes. You guys can also subscribe to the Digipreneur.fm website, subscribe to the push notification list, and also the email list so you guys can stay up to date on all things happening with the podcast, all right? That is it from me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. And I know I told you guys I would have, one episode a week because it's December and I'm kind of winding down too. But we'll see. I might drop another episode. We will see how we do later on this week. But if I don't drop an episode this week, I will see you guys in the next week. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. All right? Enjoy and take care.
You've been listening to the Digiboss, Keron Rose. We hope your notepad was filled after this episode. Make sure to like, rate, and review the show. The learning doesn't stop, folks. And to make sure you don't miss any gems from the Digiboss, go over and follow him on all social media platforms at Keron Rose. Folks, don't just sit there with a notepad. We need you to implement at least one thing into your business before the next episode. That's the only way your business levels up. Thanks for listening to Digipreneur FM. Now go be great.